I can remember when I was at school, I hated the fact that seemingly right from the very start of the holidays in all the shops you had this back to school. Whether it's pens and pencils they were selling or clothes or whatever. And as a child, of course, when you break up the school holidays, it seems like they're going to last forever. Sadly, they don't. And as somebody who still works in a school, I'm facing return to work next week. And I think church life is a bit like this too, isn't it? We tend to slacken off a bit during the summer, and then things rev up again in September. Apparently in France they have a word for this. Does anybody know the word?
Rentrée.
Thank you. Yeah, could you say that again?
Rentrée.
I could not have said it like that. And can you define it for us as well then, please?
Coming back, re-entering.
Yes, it's because I think in France, most people... Check your mic. Thank you. Yes. Is that better? Yes. Most people have their holidays together in August, and so everything starts up in September, and church is very much like that too. And if we're thinking about the new year, I think in reality, September is more like a new year than January in what happens. So it's a good time to remind ourselves why we are here. And you can take that in different ways, whether you mean here in church or here on earth or here in the sense of being believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. None of us were born Christians. And I'm going to be looking at these verses in a minute where Paul reminds the Colossians what has happened to them. But thinking of not being born a Christian, I have a granddaughter, and she's now 10 months old, and we spent a week with her and her parents on holiday, and she's very cute, and she's beginning to make noises, and she appreciates her granddad's ability to play beat po, which I'm very good at. Still very cute. Gets a bit stroppy at times, and will do increasingly in the future, sadly, because due to her parents and her grandparents, she's been saddled with a human nature which will lead her into trouble. And sooner or later, and I hope very much and pray as her grandfather sooner, she will need to be born again, as we all do. And Paul here in this letter, which was read to us so clearly, is speaking to Christians who've recently been born again. None of them have been Christians very long. And so he's reminding them about what's happened to them, reminding them perhaps because they perhaps didn't fully understand it in the first place. And we're going to look at this chapter under these three headings. Verses 1 to 4, he asked them to remember what's happened to them. Think about what's happened to them. And I think the bulk of my time this morning will be spent perhaps on unwrapping what it means to be a Christian, to be born again. But then he goes on in verses 5 to 9 to tell people to be ruthless with the life they used to live and the things they used to do. And then from verse 10 on, he encourages them to be renewed in their new life as they should be as Christians. So, starting with the first one, remember, verses 1 to 4. And he reminds them of certain things that have happened to them. He tells them that they've been raised with Christ. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. He tells them that they have died. That's in verse 3. For you died. And he also has said that in verse 20 of the previous chapter, since you died with Christ. So he's telling the Colossian Christians they've died, and he's telling them they've been raised. And in verse 4, he tells them that Christ is their life and that they will be with him in glory. Some years ago, Shirley and I had our mortgage with a company called Alliance and Leicester. And along with other small banks and mortgage providers a few years ago, they got into difficulties, not as much difficulty as some, but things were looking dodgy, and the vultures and the predators and the whoever were circling. Luckily for the Alliance and Leicester, a big Spanish bank called Santander came to their rescue. Now, why am I telling you this? Because for Alliance and Leicester, it was like being killed and being raised to life. Because over a period of time in the Alliance and Leicester, the uniforms changed. They changed from their old Alliance and Leicester uniforms to the new uniforms. The signs outside changed, so all the ones that previously had said Alliance and Leicester now changed to become Santander. And presumably, although I'm not an expert, presumably their business practices changed as they were under new management. Now, this is a picture of what has happened to each one of us here this morning who is a Christian. We were in debt of sin. We were guilty before God. Now, we might say it like this. We might say, I decided to become a Christian. We might say, I committed my life to Christ, or some expression like that. And that is not the same thing as saying, I decided to become a vegetarian. I decided to become a Liberal Democrat. It's not the same thing at all. It may feel like it's the same, or it may seem to be the same, but it's not. Because when you decide to become a Christian, when you commit your life to the Lord Jesus Christ, the main thing that happens is not what you're doing, it's what God does. He does something. So for the Alliance and Leicester, it wasn't just a case of them saying, now we belong to Santander. It wasn't that they were saying it, it was that it had actually happened. They had been taken over. All their dodgy debts were covered by this enormous great bank. They were now safe. But various things followed as a consequence. And I suppose you might say it was a loss of independence, a loss of autonomy. But then for the people who work for Alliance and Leicester, surely it's far better to work for Santander than to be unemployed, which might have been the consequence. So that's a picture of what Paul is talking about when he speaks of Christians as people who have died with Christ and have been raised to life with Christ. Our old life is in the process of being wound down, and our new life is in the process of being built up. I suppose it's a little bit like Alliance and Leicester 2 or 3 weeks into the period when they were taken over. It may look the same, but change is coming. And so it is with us. And because of that, in these first 4 verses, where Paul's asking us to remember, he tells us in verse 1, set our hearts on things above. And then in verse 2, set your minds on things above. So he's telling us, no good hankering after the old days, how wonderful it was when we were Alliance and Leicester. Look to the future. Look to what's coming. Look to what God has done for you. And there's that wonderful expression in verse 3, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. I want to tell you a story to illustrate this, and I hope it does. When we worked in Thailand, we had a colleague called Bill Fiji. And that's some kind of foreign name, the Fiji part. And I know this because his mother, and possibly his father too, I don't know, were from somewhere in what used to be called the Iron Curtain countries. Possibly Nazi Germany. I'm not quite sure how old they were, but they lived in a totalitarian state, and where you live in fear. But they had emigrated to Canada, and they had become Canadians. But Bill recounted this day when he and his brother were in the house with their mother. Possibly the father was out at work, and for whatever reason, a platoon of Canadian soldiers who were on manoeuvres, doing what soldiers do, stopped outside their house. Now, this is Canada. You know, soldiers are nice in Canada. Not a problem. Nothing to worry about. If Bill Fijis' mother had been a full-on Canadian, she might have offered them a cup of tea or something, or coffee maybe. But because of her background, she saw these soldiers outside and she was terrified. She went ballistic. And this was an experience that Bill and his older brother, it was imprinted on their mind. You know, it's pretty appalling if you're a child and suddenly your parents, who are supposed to be in control of the situation, are completely lost it. She was absolutely scared out of her skin by the fact of these soldiers standing outside. And I suppose you could say she was having a flashback to her time living in a totalitarian country where if there were soldiers outside your house, you needed to be scared. But she lived in Canada. She was a Canadian. She didn't need to be frightened of those soldiers. And so it is with us as Christians. We're born again. We're sons and daughters of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, his brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of God the Father. We've been adopted into his family. But the trouble is, so often we forget that. So often we live and we think and we feel and we respond just like everybody else. And we forget that we've now been adopted into God's family. We forget that our future is above, with Christ seated on the right hand of God. Now that is what Paul is reminding the Colossians in these first 4 verses. He's saying, no, your old life is finished. That is done with. You may not feel like it is, it may not always seem like it is, but that is the reality. Your old life is over and your new life has begun. So, having established that, Paul goes on to tell the Colossians they need to be ruthless with their old life. Just like Bill Fijis' mother needed to be ruthless with herself. She needed to pull herself together for the sake of her children and think, no, I'm in Canada, I don't need to be frightened of these soldiers. Or the people who worked for Alliance and Leicester need to be happy to don the new uniform, be happy to adopt the new procedures, because this is the reality. They've been taken over. And so it is with us as Christians. And the Lord wants us to be ruthless with all that hangs over from our old life. He says in verse 5, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And then there's a list. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. And then in verse 8, there's another list. Rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language. I think there's a danger for us as Christians that we look at lists like that and we think, well, it doesn't really apply to me. I'm okay there, fine. But the point is, Paul was writing to people who lived in a pagan city of the first century who did all this stuff. This was normal for them. And so when we read this passage, we have to ask ourselves, what is normal for us? What is normal, non-Christian behavior? Right? Now, idolatry, well, not really. Some of these things probably do apply. But the question we have to ask ourselves as Christians, perhaps those who've recently become Christians, is what was normal in my old life which is alien to my new life? And I can't tell you what that is. You have to think about that for yourself. You have to decide for yourself what thought patterns, what behaviors, what strategies that you adopted in social situations or at work, whatever things in your old life you no longer sit comfortably with as a Christian. I became a Christian at the age of 19, and for me, one of the first things I realized was I was a rather sort of a gossipy, talk about people behind their backs, manipulative, not very good at it, mind you, kind of person. And I suddenly realized, this no longer was right. This no longer fitted with who I was supposed to be. And what Paul is saying here in these verses really is be true to yourself. The person who is not yet a Christian is true to themselves when they do what they do. The person who is a Christian, if they continue in that same behavior that they were doing before, they are no longer being true to themselves because now they're somebody else. So they're doing things which no longer fit with the person they are. That is the difference between a non-Christian and a Christian. If you're a non-Christian, your life, the things that you do, they're natural, they're normal, they're what everybody else does. You're just acting the way you've been brought up, the way your friends behave. You're just doing normal stuff. And it's not really a problem to you. When you become a Christian, you may do many of those same things, but now they are alien. And Paul is saying, don't stay like that. Don't carry on doing things which are now contrary to your new nature. He's saying, you must change. And the last reference there on the screen is to what Jesus said. I trust we all understand that when he spoke of gouging out your eye and cutting off your hand, he was speaking figuratively. After all, you have another eye and another hand. And so if that was really the way to solve that problem, you'd have to do both eyes or both hands. One wouldn't do. He was speaking figuratively, and he was saying you have to be ruthless with all those things that you now know you shouldn't do. Okay, moving on finally then. Paul states the negative here, but he also states the positive. But notice, first of all, sorry, I'm just finding my place. In verse 9, he says, you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed. That's in verse 10. And it's already happened. That's my first point up there. I'm looking at that one. It's already happened. That may surprise you, but if you've understood what I've said up to now, it's already happened. Your life may not quite match with that, but it has already happened. Your old self has been taken off by the Lord Jesus Christ, and your new self has been put on. But we have to live like it. And it's interesting to note, just going back for a moment, Paul reminds us that we died with Christ, but then in verse 5 he says, put to death. So it's both something which has been done to us and something we have to do for ourselves as well. It's both. So going on then, in verse 12, he tells us to clothe ourselves. And we have there the idea of taking off your old clothes, putting on your new clothes, which was so well demonstrated for us earlier. Verses 15 and 16, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. And verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. So there's a whole list of things here which clearly we don't have time to discuss this morning. We know what most of them are. Even those children who stood on the platform knew which were the good things and which were the bad things. And I think all of us here do. So we don't really need me to go through all of these things and tell you why they're good or what they are. We all know that, don't we? We all know what's good. And Paul is telling us here, concentrate on that. Think about it. Do it. And as Paul keeps emphasizing, it all starts in the mind and the heart. And I would like to finish by asking you, as I've been speaking this morning, is it true of you? Have you experienced what I've been talking about? It happened to me when I was 19. I'd been a churchgoer since I was 9 years old. I was a choir boy. And then I was a man in the choir. I used to dress up in, the old-fashioned clothes, walk down the aisle and all that stuff. And I thought I was a Christian until I met real Christians. And then I realized I wasn't a Christian at all. And I didn't really even know what a Christian was. I thought a Christian was somebody who believed in God, went to church. That was about it, really. And I discovered a Christian was somebody who was a transformed person, whose whole outlook on life was completely different to what mine was. And I found these people very attractive. I wanted to be like them. I'd like to close with this verse, which is from an earlier part of Colossians. This is how it's possible for us to begin this journey of new life. And it's from Colossians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. So, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that is in Jesus Christ, and through him, that is Jesus Christ, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. In our first service this morning, as we do every Sunday, we thought about Jesus' death on the cross, the blood which flowed from the wounds in his hands and feet and side, which the Bible tells us cleanses us from sin if we accept the Lord Jesus as our Saviour. It's both something we do and it's something God does. I suppose from our point of view, the first step is taken by us, although in reality, it's because God has prompted us. And it may be for you this morning, God is speaking to you now. And God is saying to you, I would like that new life. I would like sin to be something that's alien to me, not something I'm completely comfortable with. I would like to experience the power that Paul is speaking of to live that new life. Well, here is the way. The Lord Jesus died on the cross and shed his blood. And the first step is to confess our sin, to put our faith in him and ask him to be our Saviour. And then he will take over. Going back to Alliance and Leicester, I presume the first move came from them. But then Santander came with all their expertise and their money, and they took over. And that's what the Lord Jesus Christ wants to do for each one of us, to pay that debt which we owe, to take over our lives and to make us into a new person that glorifies him.